In the 80s, unless you're over the age of 50, you probably don't remember this particular time period and situation, but in the 80s, there were a number of televangelist scandals that were very, very embarrassing to Christian folk and to church folk. The two scandals were led by PTL, praise the Lord, leaders Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and by Jimmy Swaggart. And those of us who were in ministry then, who are now over the age of 60, have pretty painful memories of those dark days. One of the reasons being is because everybody in America was talking about it. It was the days before the internet. It was the days before satellite television. So you got, 3 or 4 channels on TV for the most part, and they were all covering it. And you had newspapers were still big, and they were all covering it, and magazines were still big, and they were all covering it, and it was nonstop. Night after night, for literally months, we had to suffer through yet another episode of what could easily be called Preachers Gone Wild. I mean, lavish lifestyles and misappropriation of donations and hush money payoffs and sexual encounters with secretaries and prostitutes. It was just a terrible, terrible time. And the Jim Baker quagmire was so sordid that it turns out money had been misappropriated for Heritage Village, a big Christian entertainment and hotel that he had built, and people actually made a coin that said PTL passed the loot instead of praise the Lord, because that seemed to be what it was really all about. And there was all sorts of accounting problems, and he went supposedly nuts and was taken away in a straitjacket, and who could forget the affair that he had, which was national news, and everybody was paying attention to that. So the truth is, churches everywhere took a pretty big hit back in the mid-'80s, and people looked at churches differently there for a little while. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I suspect a team of shrinks could spend years burrowing down into the layers of issues that caused Baker and Swaggart to do what they did and still not come up with an answer. But there's one thing I do know. Like the subject of our study, Solomon, at some point they were seduced. I think we can assume there was a point where they were normal, down-to-earth, level-headed guys. And then there came a point where they weren't. And it didn't likely happen overnight. Probably happened gradually. At some point, their glory became more important to them than God's glory was to them. I don't know what it was. Perhaps it was the TV thing, always having their hair and makeup just right and a camera in their faces and an adoring audience hanging on every word, writing them letters and phone calling them and sending them money and begging for their prayers as if their prayers somehow carried more weight than anybody else's. I don't know exactly what it was, but most churches and ministries just scratch and claw to pay their bills, and the PTL Club was swimming in millions of dollars of cash. But it turned out he was keeping 2 separate accounts, and they were actually completely broke, and they had defrauded the investors in Heritage Village. I don't think there are very many people who could experience so much worldly success without having some serious ego issues. We've been talking about what led to the downfall of the world's wisest man, the world's richest man, the world's most blessed man, who started so well. Solomon did. What exactly led to his downfall? I think it has a lot to do with what we've talked about already this morning, and that is ego issues. Because in 1 Kings 3, at the very beginning of his reign, Solomon was a picture of humility. Think carefully about his responses. The night the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, "What do you want? Anything. Ask. I'll give it to you." And Solomon replied, "You showed great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he was honest and true and faithful to you. And you've continued to show this great and faithful love to him today by giving him a son to sit on his throne. Now, O Lord my God, you have made me a king instead of my father David, but I'm like a little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your," watch this phrase, "your own chosen people, a nation so great and so numerous that they cannot be counted. Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" 3 times in 2 verses. He talks about your people. Your people. There may be no better picture of humility in the entire Bible than the way Solomon started his kingship. He acknowledged that he was on the throne only because God had put him there. He admitted that he was not up to the task of governing a great nation like this. He said, "I'm like a little kid who doesn't know his way around even. And by the way, even if I were grown up, who possibly could know how to govern this great people of yours? This great people of yours." Solomon understood they were God's people, not his. And that he was simply being called upon to serve. We get a little deeper into the scriptures today, you will see that his entire meaning had changed so that he begins to call them his people, not God's people, and so that he literally makes slaves out of his own people for his own glory. But at this point, early on, we want to stand up and applaud Solomon. How unique is it, especially for people in our generation, to see a national leader who is not full of himself, who doesn't think he has all the answers, who understands who is really in control and who is really in charge, and that's God. But sadly, it wasn't very long before Solomon's ego began to grow. In 1 Kings chapter 3, his ego is well contained. Healthy, strong, a king needs one, but certainly not out of control. But over the next 7 chapters, it swells and morphs into an absolute monstrosity. And where you see it so vividly is in his prayers at the dedication of the temple. 6 times he says something like this in one chapter, in chapter 8. 6 times he says, "Now I have built a glorious temple for you, O Lord, a place where you can live forever." I have built, he says no less than 6 times in one speech that is given here in one chapter. Now, a couple things there. First of all, he didn't build it. We're about to find out he used mostly foreign slaves to build it. So, first of all, he really didn't build it. And secondly, he has flipped from this great people of yours and how can I possibly serve you to I have built. He has flipped quickly from you to me. And that fact has some special meaning for me because back in 2007, we built this building here It was constructed over a period of about a year and a half. I had been the senior minister for 23 years at the time we built that building, and I was involved in the whole process, from the purchase of the property to the laying of the carpet to the negotiation of the sale of the Estero campus with Charles Duray, including 2 critical meetings with the mayor of Fort Myers in his office. But if I had stood up at the dedication service and talked about, I have built this building, I imagine the elders would rightfully have charged the stage and physically dragged me out of the pulpit. And that's exactly what Solomon was doing here. I can't imagine too many words more ego bloated than I have built. That completely disregards the architects and the construction managers and the financial donors and the physical laborers and the inspectors and the skilled craftsmen. And I can assure you, I could not have done one single job of any of those. Maybe Solomon could, I don't know, but I couldn't have. Without all of those kinds of people working together, no building project could ever be completed. You will never hear a baseball player say, I won the World Series by myself. You will never hear a congressman say, well, you might, I passed the law by myself. You will never hear a husband say, I had a baby. You better not. Mark it down, when the word I starts replacing the word we in your speech, something has happened to your heart. And ego has set in. Other indications of Solomon's inflating ego is seen all over the book of Ecclesiastes, where he tried literally everything possible, and he had the capability of doing it in order to bring himself satisfaction in life. He said, so I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me. Now that's that alone, that's a pretty big statement. First of all, you're backhanding your daddy in the face, right? David's the only man ever called a man after God's own heart, wrote over half the Psalms, the shepherd warrior. So first of all, you're backhanding your daddy in his face, but you're kind of leaving out a few other semi-important people too, like maybe Moses, Abraham. I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me, and my wisdom never failed. My wisdom, oh, I see. My wisdom never failed me. Well, where did he get that wisdom from? God, because he asked for it wisely. But suddenly it's his wisdom. Anything I wanted, I'd take. I denied myself no pleasure. I even found great pleasure in hard work, a reward for all my labors. You thinking about arrogance, you think about all the people who had lived in Jerusalem before Solomon. And then you think about saying, my wisdom never failed me. Not the wisdom God gave me never failed me. That's not what he said. He said, my wisdom never failed me. In their book, Lead Like Jesus, Ken Blanchard and Phil Hodges said the word ego can stand for edging God out. And I thought that's so strong and so powerful and so true, because whenever we are edging God to the margins of our life and taking credit for things in our life ourselves, as Solomon was doing here, it is a problem with ego. God's glory was slowly being edged out by his own. And if you're looking for a single reason why Solomon's life got completely off track, this might be it. I understand there are people, and I agree with them, by the way. There are people who say that having a proper and healthy ego is a key to success. The logic goes something like this. People with big egos perceive themselves in such positive terms that it's almost impossible for them to see themselves failing, which, if you believe in the power of positive thinking, actually increases their chances of succeeding. We all know that the more you think positively about something, the better chance you have of getting it done. So people with big egos sometimes see themselves as smarter and more capable than everybody else, and they behave accordingly. They behave in the way they see what they want to see, and then they act as if what they see is real and true. And so often they take charge and accept risks that other people shy away from and won't even try. And so they sometimes develop a sort of an aura around them that frightens other people and potential enemies or adversaries. And the result is that people with big egos often win battles without fighting a single shot, because other people are intimidated by it. I don't have any argument with any of that. I understand that's a part of human nature. That's life. That's part of philosophy and personality. Anybody can see that wimpy, insecure people are seldom high achievers. But just as athletes get a boost from steroids, the athletes also have to deal with the side effects of those steroids. And some of those side effects are long-lasting. And Solomon gets this huge boost in his ego by what God has given him and done for him, and he accomplishes a lot of great things, but there were some side effects that came from that ego. One of those side effects was a little bit of a disconnection from reality. For instance, Solomon ended up with 700 wives and 300 concubines. On what planet is that considered normal? Huh? Don't you think that a guy that wasn't starting to get a little too egotistical at about wife 11 or 39 or 220 might say, we might ought to start looking at how we're doing things here? I just can't imagine what that would have been like. Think of the multiplicity of different personalities. Picture the cat fights that must have gone down in the women's quarters. Can you picture that? As Solomon's more domineering wives try to assert themselves. They've made all these reality TV shows of the housewives of, I don't know where they're all from. Honestly, I've never seen a minute of any of them, but housewives of New Jersey and housewives of Atlanta and all the different things. And the reason they make and then you've got The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, and all of that is because people naturally, I've never seen 1 second of any of the shows that I just said, but people naturally catfight in positions and situations like that. Imagine the whining that must have filled the air as first one woman after another felt mistreated or neglected, and picture Solomon getting drug into the fracas as a mediator or a peacemaker, because after all, he's the wisest man in the world. He said he was. Obviously, it had to have been a completely absurd situation that only a person who had lost touch with reality would ever have allowed to develop. Did he not, or did one of his advisors not say at some point, wait a minute, this situation's getting out of control. Maybe we ought to take a look at how we're doing things with accepting these daughters of foreign kings as wives. Even the most dedicated ladies' man of all time, whoever he was, for all I know, he may have been John Brooks, might be the most dedicated ladies' man of all time. But whoever he was would surely call time out and question the wisdom of collecting wives like you collect baseball cards or antique cars. But that's the thing about big ego people. They almost never back up and take a look at what's going on in their life. And why should they? Because they're pretty well convinced that they're right. Solomon was pretty well convinced that he was right. Why wouldn't he be convinced of that? God himself had given him the greatest wisdom in the world. Why wouldn't he be convinced of that? It never occurs to people with enormous egos that they might be on the wrong track. They're so infatuated with themselves that they can see nothing but the beautiful image in the mirror. And that's one of the problems with ego that will cause any man or woman, whether it's in Solomon's time or in our time, to fall miserably from the best and the blessings that God has to offer them. Ego can cause you to get distance from reality. It really can. And another side effect of it is it can cause an insensitivity to the problems and needs of other people. Because you really are mostly thinking about only yourself. And Solomon became very insensitive. This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, the royal palace, the supporting terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and these three cities. Now, I want you to focus on two words here, okay? Forced labor. We have a word for that. It's called slavery. Forced labor is slavery. He was using slaves, non-Israelites, who were in the land, primarily to build the temple. In an apparent contradiction, 1 Kings 5:13 says he also conscripted a labor force of 30,000 men from all of Israel. So if you put the two passages together, what it appears to be is there were slaves who were conscripted to serve permanently, and those 30,000 Israelites were given time off and worked kind of a regular job in the temple. But here's the point. This forced labor was hated by the people, considered oppressive, bitterly resented by the people. The king wasn't supposed to do this. God had told the king, don't do this. Don't work the people this hard. Don't tax the people this much. And we know they resented it so much because after Solomon's death, representative of the northern tribes and the southern tribes approached his successor Rehoboam and said, "Look, your father was a hard master. Lighten the harsh labor demands and the heavy taxes that your father imposed on us, then we will be your loyal subjects." Hey, just give us a little bit of a break, Solomon's son. And if you will give us a little bit of a break from these slave labor demands and heavy taxes and expectations, we will be your loyal subjects forever. You know what happened. Rehoboam was even harder than Solomon was. And it led to a civil war. And the northern kingdom split from the southern kingdom, never to come together again. And in a matter of a few years, the northern kingdom was removed from the face of the earth. See, in typical big ego fashion, Solomon was obsessed with his building projects. So determined to see them completed, so anxious to have the big ceremony and bask in their magnificent glory so he can say, "I have built this," that he was willing to overwork and overtax his people. Have you ever worked for a person who was in love with himself or herself? If you have, you know that they're only really concerned with their own needs. And the only reason they will ever address your problems or your needs is if they somehow tie into theirs. That's right. If somehow it can tie into theirs. I'm sure you can imagine how frustrating that is, and I know many of you have probably worked in a setting or an environment like that. Well, think about this. All the Israelites were working in that kind of setting and environment that Solomon, the wisest man in the world, had created. And he had created it because his ego was out of control. And this is one of the most visible side effects of having a big ego. Your insensitivity will cause people to not like you or respect you. Words like arrogant or pompous or stuck up or prima donna will be used to describe you. And your employees, because they have to, because you're paying them, may nod and listen to what you say. And then when you turn around, they roll their eyes and complain as soon as you go the opposite direction. That's exactly what was happening here with Solomon. And the minute that he died, the people started speaking out. Saw it as their chance to maybe get a little bit of a lifestyle change. Didn't get it. Rehoboam had the big ego too. Wonder where he got it from. Solomon may have looked magnificent perched on the throne in his royal robes, but outside the palace walls, the people were belly aching and ready, absolutely ready for rebellion, which happened soon after. What's another side effect of having a big ego? A diminishing view of God. In John chapter 3, we find John the Baptist running a really robust baptism ministry in preparation for the coming of Christ. Thus, we get the name John the Baptist. Now, he could have tried to parlay that into a larger role of his own in God's plan. He might have said, as many people with ego have, look at all these people coming to me for baptism. Surely I've earned a promotion. Surely God realizes what's happening here. Maybe Jesus will now allow me to hang around and work alongside him as a full and equal, trusted partner. But that wasn't his role. That's not what God had made him to be or to do. And so because, unlike Solomon, he had no similar ego, when he saw Jesus, he pointed to Jesus and said to the people, he must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less. Here are your bookend examples of ego in the Scripture. Solomon, John the Baptizer. Solomon was just the opposite. As his ego grew and grew, he became less concerned about God's will and more concerned with Solomon's will. As his ego continued to grow and grow, he became less concerned about God's glory and more concerned about his own glory. So 1 Kings 6 says the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid in the mid-spring during the 4th year of Solomon's reign, just 4 years in. The entire building was completed in every detail by mid-autumn during the 11th year of his reign. So it took 7 years to build the temple. And the next verse says, now watch this, Solomon also built a palace for himself. And it took him 13 years to complete the construction. All righty now. 7 years to build the beautiful temple of God. 13 years to build his own big, beautiful palace. Twice as long, in other words. Now imagine, if you will, if your preacher, that's me, lived in a house that was twice the cost and size of the church building. In our case, that would be me living in a 60,000 square foot house that cost $23 million. In other words, I'd be living in Joel Osteen's house. I'm not kidding. I know that was cheap, but you can't imagine the joy it brought me to do it. But seriously now, and seeing nothing wrong with it, and not thinking you should see anything wrong with it. Here's a simple and undeniable fact. The larger any person's ego gets, the less they care about God's glory, the more they care about their own glory. Now, Solomon never stopped going through the motions of worship, but at some point, his religious activities ceased to be about God's glory and become instead a vehicle for self-promotion, which is the exact thing Jesus told us don't ever do. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who love to pray publicly on street corners and in the synagogues where everybody can see them and hear them. I tell you the truth, that's all the reward they will ever get. That's their reward. Their ego was fed. And that's the only reward they'll ever get. They won't get a reward from God. Notice the phrase, they love to pray. Egomaniacs are the most overtly religious people in the church. They love to pray. They love to teach. They love to do anything that puts them in the spotlight. What they don't love is God as much as they love themselves. All of us have to sometimes check ourselves out in the ego department. On the other hand, if you start embracing humility like the Bible does, you don't have to worry about suddenly losing your mojo. Some of the most successful people in the history of the world were known for their humility. Try Googling. That's what I did working on this lesson. I Googled the most humble people in history. And several names came up, names of people we all would know. Leonardo da Vinci, St. Francis of Assisi, Abraham Lincoln, Albert Einstein, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, a host of other people who have pretty well earned worldwide respect by how they have lived and what they believed and how they set aside ego and exchanged it for humility. So what does it mean to embrace humility? Well, first, it means admitting you're not a slave to your own ego. Big ego people, when challenged about their arrogance, trot out that ever-popular catch-all excuse that spiritual lazy people have been falling back on for centuries. Well, this is just the way God made me. Or this is just the way I'm wired. Well, first of all, nobody made God with a huge ego and no humility. Secondly, if you're wired that way, you can change. You have a choice. The Bible tells us, humble yourself before the Lord, and He will lift you up in honor. But embracing humility also means submitting to the authority of God. Why? Because all arrogance is ultimately defiance against God. It plays itself horizontally out in our careers and in our relationships. But if you drill down to the real core of the problem, what you always find is a heart perched on the throne that rightfully belongs to God. What you always find is edging God out. And that's why Peter said, humble yourself under the mighty power of God, and He will lift you up. And finally, embracing humility means abandoning your lust for position. Do Do you remember, great example of this in the ministry of Jesus, great example. Do you remember when Mrs. Zebedee approached Jesus and requested that her two sons, James and John, be allowed to sit at the right hand of God? I've tried to picture before Jesus taking that request from James and John's his mom. And I've tried to picture how he would have reacted, maybe what his facial expression would have been. But the way I picture him, he would just sort of sigh internally so as to not embarrass her completely and take a deep breath and then patiently and lovingly explain what every Christian needs to know and remember. And that is, in his kingdom, greatness is not achieved by jockeying for position. It is accomplished by serving others as greater beings than yourself. And whoever wants to be first among you, he said to James and John and to Mrs. Zebedee, whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of God came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. What a contrast. What a contrast. In practical terms, abandoning your quest for position means you're not always trying to edge your way closer and closer toward the spotlight, and you're willing to serve. You're willing to serve even if you know you're not going to get any credit. It means you don't always have to have your own way, that you recognize other people can have good ideas too, and you can have bad ones. It means you don't pout or pursue payback when you don't get your way. It means you take responsibility for your mistakes instead of trying to funnel blame off onto others. Most of all, what humility means is, here we go again, you're going to say, those 12 words that he's repeated 12,000 times. I am sorry. I was wrong. Please forgive me. I love you. Humble people can easily say those 12 words. Egocentric people usually can't get even 3 of them out. The first 3. I was wrong. I understand that embracing humility can be hard for people who have reaped great benefits from being egomaniacal. Once you get your fanny planted on a throne, it is awful hard to take it off there on your own. But the alternative is to be a little disconnected from reality, with probably people genuinely not liking you and maybe even rebelling against you like they did against Solomon. And the biggest problem is walking against God as his opponent rather than his friend, because, as the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace or favor to the humble. Think about that. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So probably the biggest problem of all, the worst side effect of all of a huge ego, is God will begin actively opposing you. Now, how much more difficult will that make your life? Life brings us enough opponents and enemies without turning God into one too. There's a great example of that I'll close with from maybe the best known and maybe the most watched movie of all time, The Wizard of Oz. If you're paying attention to it, there's a sermon illustration about every 5 or 10 minutes from start to finish. I mean, take the wizard himself. He is the great and powerful Oz, a legend through Munchkin Land, the beating heart of Emerald City. People, or rather munchkins, bow and scrape and tremble in his presence. Nobody dares to question his wisdom or anything that would disobey one of his commandments. But in the end, he's exposed, right? It turns out he's just a man. and a pretty bumbling one at that. His cover is blown. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Solomon wound up being very Oz-like when he didn't have to be. He could have had it all, rolling in the deep. But he blew it. He was very Oz-like. He could have had it all. He was legendary throughout the known world. Accomplished people like the Queen of Sheba came and brought him gifts and said, "The half has not been told of his wisdom and of his riches and of his kingdom." And yet in the end, he was exposed. Failures piling so high that his successor couldn't even avoid a civil war that divided the land. So bumbling that all the blessings he had been given him couldn't keep him from falling. So cynical that he wrote an entire book, Ecclesiastes, in which he concludes by saying everything is vain. Everything is meaningless except following the Lord. I wish I had remembered that. Don't kid yourself. We're all just a man or a woman, and we can be bumbling ones at that. Ego is not good for us like it wasn't for him. It will sink us like it sunk him and many, many others. And that's another lesson we learn from this legendary leader, Solomon.